So welcome to the session on emerging domains of radiological protection. We have what, not quite a lightning round, but several fairly short talks, about 10 minutes each, to highlight some of the emerging domains. They're not all, but some interesting things that might crop up, particularly looking forward towards the next set of recommendations. So with that, I'm going to jump right into it, because our time is a bit limited. Our first speaker is Jacqueline Garnet-Laplace from the Nuclear Energy Agency in France, and also from the ICRP.
Okay, thank you, Nicole, for the introduction. Can I have my slides, please? Okay. So thank you. I'm lucky enough to have my co-authors in the audience, so I'm sure that we will be strong in answering your questions. We wanted to share with you some ideas and about new methods that has been developing to enhance the strength of evidence in demonstrating protection of the environment from exposure to ionizing radiation. First, let me setting very briefly the scene of about ICRP and protection of the environment. You certainly know that ICRP has established a graded approach to demonstrate the protection of the environment in its publication 108 and a series of more technical documents that are listed there. This document provides protection targets, mainly maintenance of biological diversity and nature conservation as an overall, and the demonstration is conducted like an ecological risk assessment approach by the use of a set of 12 reference animals and plants, as shown on the figure on your right hand, and their related DCRL, so the derived reference consideration reference levels. In the ERA type approach, those RAP are there for assessing wildlife exposure and effects, and the DCRL as serving as benchmark ranges so that you can use the dose or dose rate estimates to compare to those benchmarks, and finally interpret the level, the likelihood of effect and severity of deleterious effects from ionizing radiation in wildlife and on what is wanted to be protected. And the critical aspects of the method deals really with the use of those 12 RAP being representing of the protection targets, meaning the biological diversity and the nature conservation. So for improving this, ICRP has developed a number of task groups, established a number of task groups. Task Group 99, which aim to broaden the RAP representativeness by using extrapolation methods and revise accordingly the DCRL by applying a new method I will explain in a few minutes. TG 105, which aims to refine the guidance for application of the basis of experience from case study and also to better integrate environmental radiological protection into the RP system. And the newborn, Task Group 125, is there to analyze whether and how ecosystem services can support a holistic approach in this area. And Task Group 114, explore the meaning of reasonableness and tolerability when applied to the environment, among others, because this is only one aspect of the analysis from this task group. Now we have got on the same page with regard to what ICRP is doing. Let me illustrate what we have developed in terms of statistical advanced methods, with the main aim to make the best use of existing effects data on non-human biota and how to manage the uncertainties related to the level of knowledge on one hand and to the use of such a statistical methods. So we have developed a stepwise approach that is illustrated on this schematic here. From the left-hand side, you will find our source of input data, Frederica, which is a database gathering all knowledge on effects of ionizing radiation in non-human species. Those data are categorized into exposure situation, acute versus chronic, and document a number of population relevant umbrella endpoints such as reproduction, morbidity, and mortality. And what we have done from quality check data from this database is to build or rebuild dose or dose rates effects relationship per species and endpoint, and obviously exposure regime, so that at the end of the day we can obtain comparable critical radiotoxicity value. Here on this example, this is a dose rate effects rebuilt for chronic exposure situation and a given species and a given endpoint, and we have extracted systematically a critical value, which is the EDR10, so the dose rate giving 10% changes in observed effects in comparison with the control. And we did so the same thing for acute exposure data and deriving the effect dose giving 50% effect in comparison to the control. So the idea is really greatly inspired by what is done in chemicals. And since from this analysis we noticed that acute exposure situation was much more documented than the chronic one, we had also the idea to elaborate an acute to chronic transformation method, which is an empirical method that allow to use acute effects to predict chronic effects. So by implementing this new method, we document even more the chronic effects data sets. So at the end of the day, we come out with a series of comparable of data set per class, meaning all the species per class and all endpoints relevant to the population demography of such species in the so-called endpoint sensitivity distribution, which is a statistical fit in between the different comparable data, making this set per class. And from this, we were able to make a robust and systematic derivation of the DCRL. I will show you in a minute. Here it is the two examples for fish and mammals. So you can notice that the endpoint sensitivity distribution shows the range of radiation sensitivity among the different endpoints, among species within the same class. So to make use of this representation, you can read on the x-axis the dose rate. This is the example for chronic exposure regime. At a dose rate of X microgram per hour, there is Y% chance of having morbidity, mortality, and or reproduction effects of more than 10% for species of that class. And like it is done for the chemical regulation, we proposed at that stage, this is under discussion within our task group and our committees, to recommend to select the 5th percentile of this distribution so that we can have a comparable benchmark to derive the DCRL. So possibly this DCRL could be based on this 5th percentile per class, and it's also possible to combine this with an extrapolation factor to take account for uncertainty and reflect the confidence we have in the data set that are underlying the endpoint sensitivity distribution. So this is a multi-criteria extrapolation factors that can be used and that can be applied to the 5th percentile and give more confidence in the outcoming value as use of benchmarks. So the other illustration I wanted to touch upon very briefly is the adverse outcome pathway concept, which has been designated as a kind of informative tool supporting the 21st century toxicology for for chemicals. And we believe that we could explore better the benefit of the AOP, and notably to identify gaps and advanced understanding of health outcomes, both for human and non-human species at low dose or low dose rates. Actually, you certainly know that this IOP concept has been developed by the OECD and being placed in the same family with the NEA, in the same families at the OECD. We established a collaboration with the OECD Chemical Safety Program through the high-level group on low-dose research, and there will be a presentation during the week by Daniel Beaton about the activity of this group, so that we can make a better use of the AOP to better structure the knowledge on biological mechanisms at low dose and low dose rate, so that we can collect all the source of information, better informed, be better organized to improve the understanding of the causal pathways between radiation exposure and risk, and consistently reduce the current knowledge limitation, establishing bridge as such between radiobiologists and epidemiologists. And there are several examples of ongoing radiation-induced AOP under development. This is my last slide, where I will focus on the way we could modernize optimization. Especially, we should include ecosystem-related protection goals as well as all other aspects relevant to proportionate decision-making. So the idea there is to develop methods such as multiple hazards, meaning radiological, but also non-radiological stressors, holistic, meaning balancing all risk-based approaches. And we believe that we should be able to translate broad policy protection goals, such as biodiversity, into operational protection goals and related criteria for risk assessment. I'm sure that Nicole will explain better, also during this week, the intentions of the newborn TG 125. And this is my last slide. And that was challenging with regard to the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. We're going to go right into our next speaker. There will be time for questions at the end for the panel discussion. So our next speaker is Mario Gomez Fernandez from NuScale Power in the United States.
Thank you, Nicole. Let's see. Oh, I feel important, actually. It's the first time that I'm invited here at the ICRP. Really, my presentation is just to give you a really brief overview of key AI fundamentals and what challenges and opportunities we will face as we, implement this algorithms in different fields. Let's see. Oh, yeah, it is working. So. Just to introduce myself really fast, Mario Gomez, like Nicole said, I do have a background in AI. Actually, a lot of my PhD work was on the safety aspects of AI. I work as a radiological engineer in NuScale Power. Unfortunately, I don't do that much research anymore. But I am also a courtesy faculty at Oregon State University, where I actually get to do some of the fun stuff. With that, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the hype about AI. So AI, there's a lot of hype around it simply because it can do a lot of very complex tasks, and some of the very notorious examples that you can see in the screen, it's, for example, you have AlphaStar or AlphaGo, AlphaZero. I don't know, I stopped keeping track of all the alphas, but the idea of the systems are that they can play very complex games and multiplayer games. Other examples are IBM Watson, Alexa, and then Google Duplex, which their very intent is to understand and comprehend language. And then another example, very, very popular right now, is autonomous controls, which, as many of you have probably seen in the news, a lot of the automotive companies are trying to develop their own autonomous system for autonomous driving. Oh. Sorry, it didn't actually change. Sorry. Oh, there you go. And yeah, well, sorry about that. And what the problem with this is that at this point we're starting to see that AI can actually enhance our capabilities and stretch our capacities. And so we are starting to see a direct benefit out of this technology. However, and this is a really key thing here, is that we're also started to develop a confidence and a level of reliance on this technology. And this is really where our key contribution could be in both different fields. And again, there's, because it can do a lot of different things, there's this perception that AI can actually do, play games, drive cars and whatnot, and it can automatically do other different tasks. And the problem is that it's not always as clear, especially, and this is another big especially, if you don't have an objective to solve. And so I want to spend a couple minutes on explaining what AI really is and what the intent was when they developed it. There's four schools of thought for AI. There is thinking humanly, which is this idea of having systems that can actually think or reason as we humans do. Acting humanly, again, when we have systems that can perform tasks that are viewed as being performed by a human. You have thinking rationally, which is about developing systems that can explain and solve a problem in the most logical manner, and acting rationally, which again is the idea of achieving the best possible outcome. Okay. Yeah, and so to narrow down, AI is a very broad topic. There's 5 fundamental subfields here. You have search, you have planning, you have credit assignment, you have inference, and then you have the pattern recognition, which a lot of people typically refer to as machine learning. Now, generally speaking, AI is trying to solve 4 main problems. The first one is what everybody would want to do at some point, is the general problem solver. And the key here in this problem is to try to develop a system that can actually do multiple tasks. So not only being good at games or speech, but also being good at different tasks. Game playing problem is very straightforward. The idea is to derive a strategy that works well with the current scenario. Question and answering, again, the whole idea of this problem is to comprehend language. Now, there's other capabilities that are starting to being implemented in the question and answering, such as actions, and you can see that in your Alexa. The fourth problem where we are seeing a lot of interest is the fourth one, which is decision making. This is where a lot of people are trying to look into how do we implement AI into our systems? How can it help, and how can we make that? And so, sorry, I flipped too quickly. And so what are the key challenges and opportunities? And I'll tell you the number one and probably the most important one is education and training, which luckily is the theme of this, or part of the theme of this conference. And it is very important because you do have to have some understanding on both disciplines. And the reason why is because you want to come up with the right questions and the right constraints to your system. And this is really the success of this other systems, because when you have a game that you want to play, you want to win it, and that's the goal. When you want to understand a question, well, that's the goal, is to comprehend the language. And so they are clearly defined, and so the challenge here, and again the opportunity, is how do we define those questions. Secondly, data. Data is key, and I'm sure you've seen in the news, there's always need for data, but be careful here, because it's not only about the data, it's about the quality of the data that you're trying to use for your system. Again, the problem with data, and we've seen this in the field, is that a lot of people just try to use data as they have it, and you will likely have a very good result, and you will be like, oh yeah, I did my first machine learning application. And if you don't ask a question of, oh, how did it do it and why did it do it that way, then you probably have a system that doesn't really work. In computer science, there's this saying that's just garbage in, garbage out. And I always like to change it a little bit to garbage in, weapon out. And the reason why is because if we implement it in the real world, this can have an impact. And so really the way we use this information also matters. And so as it is the nature of every new technology, there's always issues, and this also creates opportunities. How do we make sure these algorithms are working as intended? What metrics can we develop for this? What does the regulator say? What do they think? How they're gonna benchmark it, and so on and so forth. Lastly, again, going back to your data, you can actually manipulate the data to create the system that you want to develop. So also very important issue that can happen. Now, and I also don't want to sound negative. I know there's a lot of questions, but these are also very key opportunities, because machine learning does promise a lot of economical and technical benefits to the development of this technology. But I also want to take the new column that I've added, the ethical. We also need to make sure that we're not using the technology in the wrong way, or that we're not creating our reliance on it, and that we are communicating well with our stakeholders, because this is very key. This is a very common theme here, which I really liked. I think there's a lot of opportunity for both fields to start talking. There's a lot of different aspects here, but one of the most popular applications right now, it's to try to assist operators in timely decision making. There's a lot of companies working in this technology, and really what I want to emphasize is that the key there, or the objective there, should always be to augment the operator's ability, and again, this is where I change the term artificial intelligence to augmented intelligence, because where our goal should be is to, enhance our capabilities. With that, I'm gonna leave you with a few questions that my mentors and I have come up over the years. They really change from field to field and from goal to goal. But things to ask, and this is, again, I'm gonna circle back to the education and training. What is your goal on the task? What is the data that you have? How complete that data is? How is that data generated? What do you want to preserve? Do you want to preserve physics? Is there some sort of interaction between a human and a machine? Are you using it for design, and so on and so forth? Again, ultimately what this does is that it will help you choose the right set of algorithms that you can use for your application. And with that, I leave you with this paper. You can always email me. This paper has a lot more detail than I could give you in 10 minutes. So thank you.
The next talk will be delivered by Dr. Ali Sadiki. He's from Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and we'll talk about advanced reactors designs and deployment, and what comes with it in terms of radiation protection challenges.
Hello, and good afternoon. My name is Ali Sadiki. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm presenting today from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. At this time, I wish to share my gratitude and respect to the Algonquin people for their care of these lands, and am thankful to be presenting at this event on these lands today. I'd also like to thank the ICRP and organizers of this session today for inviting me to speak. A quick background on myself: I'm the head of CNL's Advanced Reactors Directorate, one of 5 such directorates in the S&T Science and Technology mission here at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. I have over a decade of experience in R&D leadership, project execution, and program management, and I've been directly involved in leading CNL's SMR R&D activities for approximately the last 5 years. So a bit of an agenda: I will introduce CNL briefly and outline the landscape of advanced reactors and SMRs in Canada today. I'll briefly discuss the different technologies that are active on the Canadian landscape, including noting a few design characteristics that may be relevant for impacting potential for nuclear workers or population exposures under different scenarios. And I'll also discuss some of the work that we have ongoing at CNL related to these crucial topics. So Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, we are Canada's national nuclear lab. Formerly, we were called Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and we are the birthplace of the CANDU power reactor technology. The laboratory houses a number of unique lab facilities, and it has a diverse team of over 3,000 staff, about 600 to 700 of which are working on our science and technology research mission. We have expertise spanning 7 decades in the design, construction, licensing, operation, and deployment of first-of-a-kind reactors, and have a great team with facilities and capabilities to be able to support federal customer needs as well as commercial customer needs in the emerging new nuclear energy technology space. It's fair to say that there's a significant increase in the years ahead of us for power demands as we target net zero. Most credible forecasts indicate we'll need 2 to 3 times as much electricity production by 2050 as we have today. And that will have to come from renewables and other clean sources of electricity generation, of which nuclear could be a very important part. Even more challenging to meet these goals may be industrial process decarbonization, necessitating very large quantities of high temperature heat that are used in industrial processes, such as at the oil sands, in mining operations, and also for hydrogen production. These are some of the hardest areas to decarbonize because they're not actually that well suited to be supplied by energy from renewables alone. Nuclear may have an extremely important niche in this industrial sector. Canada also has a number of remote communities that are very reliant on fossil fuels. All of these will be a challenge to decarbonize in the years ahead, and we really do need all the tools in our toolbox. Advanced reactors and SMRs are an opportunity for Canada to decarbonize. Over the last few years, several important government documents, framework announcements have been made, including SMRs and new nuclear specifically. These include the Climate Change Plan and the Hydrogen Strategy, as well as the SMR Roadmap and Action Plan. Essentially, these all indicate that SMRs and advanced reactors may play a really important role over the coming decades. Indeed, new nuclear is essential to complement other technologies to ensure energy security as we seek to decarbonize our society. There is also a very attractive domestic and international market that is projected to be worth on the order of many billions of dollars per year. The industry has worked to articulate a deployment strategy for SMRs in Canada and have followed an approach with 3 distinct streams of reactors. I'll talk a little bit about each one, including the timelines that are projected ahead of us. Stream 1 is grid-scale reactors. These would be reactors suitable for hooking up to today's existing electricity grid. Typically, these are seen as incremental design changes on existing technologies, so-called Generation 3 or Generation 3 Plus designs. The GE Hitachi BWRX 300 that was recently selected by Ontario Power Generation and Saskatchewan Power for deployment is a very good example of this Stream 1 technology. The unit at Darlington, which will be the very first BWRX 300 unit deployed, is targeting deployment as early as 2028. This is going to be the first of what promises to be many of such units in Canada. Stream 2 is advanced reactors, so-called Generation 4 reactors, typically incorporating different coolants, not water, but in many cases sodium or molten salts or gas-cooled. There are 2 different vendors that are working with New Brunswick Power today. ARC 100 concept, which is a sodium fast reactor, and the Moltex concept, which is a molten salt reactor concept. Both of these are targeting deployment at the end of this decade and into the 2030s. And Stream 3 is micro reactors. The ultra-safe nuclear corporation reactor concept that is moving to demonstration at the Chalk River site is a good example of a microreactor active here in Canada today. The Westinghouse eVinci concept is another, and they have an affiliation with Bruce Power and SAS Research Council. They're moving to deployment as early as 2026 and certainly have targets into this remainder of this decade. There are several technologies that are active in Canada today, and I've mentioned a few of them. Here's just one slide to summarize the range of different technologies that are being considered by reactor developers. These range from light water reactors that are smaller and simplified versus contemporary large light water reactors. There are heat pipe reactors that incorporate small reactor cores intended for remote operation. There are a range of different molten salt concepts with liquid halide salt fuel. This could be fuel that's dissolved in a chloride salt or a fluoride salt. These operate at relatively high temperatures, but still remaining at low pressure. There are high temperature gas-cooled reactor concepts that typically utilize helium as a coolant and coated particle fuel, such as the TRISO fuel concept, with a mostly graphite core. This could be a pebble bed type reactor arrangement or a prismatic reactor core arrangement. And there are liquid metal fast reactors. I've already mentioned a sodium cooled fast reactor, for example. All of these technologies are quite different and quite distinct from the more typical CANDU reactors that we're familiar with here in Canada, or the well understood, well utilized light water reactors that exist around the world today. CNL's research role really is the deployment of SMRs in Canada, supporting the multiple levels of government and industry as Canada's premier national nuclear laboratory. We have the facilities and expertise to support this emerging market and support SMRs technically as they look to solve any challenges towards deploying these technologies around the country. Our ongoing research programs include several focus areas, including enhancing national and global security, nuclear preparedness and emergency response, as well as supporting safe, secure, and responsible use of nuclear technologies and providing the risk-informed, science-based evidence for regulatory decision-making. I'm unable to go through in detail all the research programs that we have active at the lab today, but we do have a range of work, including experimental programs covering all of these reactor technologies, as well as analysis and modeling efforts, really trying to focus in on the potential for reactor accident scenario studies, as well as understanding the individual phenomena at play. CNL also participates broadly with the international community involved with the IAEA, OECD NEA, and Gen 4 International Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali, although he's not here. I'd like to introduce now Gillian Hurst from Arpenza, and she'll be talking about norm management in decommissioning of offshore oil and gas pipeline infrastructures.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in Vancouver, and having been part of the organising committee at the last symposium held in Adelaide, I'd really like to congratulate the Canadian team on getting to this point and weathering the delays put upon us by the pandemic. I was very relieved not to be in your position. It's also good to reflect that at the Paris 2017 symposium, when I was giving a presentation on Australia's implementation of environmental radiation protection, that on my closing slide, it was identified that decommissioning of oil and gas infrastructure was a future challenge for Australia. So let's see where we've come in 5 years. And first of all, I'd really like to acknowledge my co-authors. They're the ones that do all the hard work. Tom Creswell from ANSTO, Amy McIntosh from Macquarie University,
Darren Koppel from the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences, and my colleagues Rick Tinker and Julia from ARPANSA. There are QR codes of some of the published work throughout this presentation, so hopefully you can follow those up. So Australia's decommissioning liability for oil and gas offshore infrastructure is estimated to be greater than $40 billion US dollars over the next 50 years. 51% of this overall liability is going to occur over the next 10 years. And the NORM disposal burden forecast is estimated to be in the range of about 200 to 1,700 tonnes for decommissioning activities up to 2060. Successful decommissioning of subsea oil and gas infrastructure requires a safe and effective approach to assess and manage waste products. In the process of oil and gas extraction, the oil-gas water mixture, as it's brought to the surface through well tubing, you see a rapid drop in temperature and pressure, and this often causes radium to precipitate out, resulting in sludges and hard scales. And not only do these contain radium and other norms, these often contain a range of trace elements in combination. In gas pipelines, sometimes the primary products tend to be the lead and polonium isotopes, and in oil pipelines you do tend to see more of the radium mineral scales. The amount of radioactivity in the mineral scales depends on a range of factors and variables: the geographic region, the depth of the reservoir, the pressure and temperature, whether there are seawater inputs, chemistry of the seawater, and so on. The review paper led by Amy, that's on this slide, examined the existing literature of across a range of contaminants, examined the different environmental regulations for decommissioning and characterisation of scales, and what it demonstrated was it showed that there was a limited number of studies that defined chemical and radiological hazards, and this was in particular for subsea structures for which there were no studies. Oops, how do I go back? As we consider the potential disposal options in Australia, there are a range of options. There's downhole disposal and into disused oil wells. You can have onshore near-surface disposal of the sludges and contaminated pipes. There can be disposal of contaminated items via smelting recycling, in situ disposal of pipelines, and in situ disposal of platforms which can be turned into artificial reefs. In order to determine the optimal disposal option, it is of course important to have a full understanding of the life cycle of the NORM and other hazards in the operational process, and this enables the identification of the NORM contaminated infrastructure and for decommissioning options. Risk assessments for the preferred decommissioning pathway should consider the risks and benefits of the various options, and complete removal of NORM-contaminated infrastructure introduces radiological risks to workers during decommissioning, waste transport and land disposal, with the potential long-term risk to people and the environment from near-surface disposal. However, in situ decommissioning of infrastructure introduces ecological risks to the marine environment that are not well understood. So in Australia, an organisation known as NOPSEMA, the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority, is the regulator for health and safety, structural integrity and environmental management for all offshore oil and gas operations in Commonwealth waters and in coastal waters where regulatory powers and functions have been conferred. NOPSEMA have regulatory expectations that a safety case, including a risk assessment, must provide evidence that reduces a risk to a level that is low as reasonably practicable to demonstrate protection of people and the environment. NOPSEMA, when they're doing these assessments, requests that decommissioning applicants seek an ARPANSA opinion on the evidence to demonstrate radiation protection, and part of this process is to ensure that the applicant applies the appropriate ARPANSA guidance. ARPANSA then communicates our opinion to NOPSEMA, and the applicant, but were not actually part of the official decision-making process. So in order to keep risk at a level that is as low as reasonably practical, this requires the operator to show through reasoned and supported arguments that there are no other practical measures that could be reasonably taken to reduce risks further. So what are some of the challenges? Social and economic impact of in situ disposal options are always under the community spotlight. A lack of published information and evidence from the industry sector to demonstrate safety and protection. Risk assessments for norm disposal often focus on single disposal options, and there is no justification for a preferred option, be that land or in situ. Mercury, lead and zinc are often encountered in combination with norm and are often considered separately. Long-term effects of possible exposure to norms are rarely considered. So in 2016, the Australian government funded the National Energy Resources Australia organisation to work with partners across government, research, science and industry to tackle some of these challenges that existed across the energy industry. Out of the NERA program, the National Decommissioning Research Initiative was established in 2019 to improve the understanding of infrastructure in offshore marine environments and to provide evidence and evidence base to inform decommissioning decisions, comparative assessments and environmental impact assessments. So over the course of the last 3 years, and prior to establishment of the NDRI, my co-authors, and in particular Tom, Amy and Darren, have been working cooperatively with a number of platform operators to undertake some of this key research. The outputs ultimately benefit industry, but it is focused on supporting independent research that brings together regulators, like ARPANSA and NOPSEMA, industry and researchers. The NDRI has been particularly important in facilitating work across 8 industry partners, with the aim of the research to deliver independent research produced as open access, peer-reviewed, in peer-reviewed publications in respected journals. So some of the publications to date. In this one, Darren examined the life of norm contamination products in the oil and gas systems, their expected exposure pathways in the marine environment, and possible ecological impacts following release. He further went on to identify the key research needs in order to better describe and understand the risks with decommissioning options, and they're listed here. And most importantly, it called for data transparency and accessibility to industry data. Tom's publication in 2022 was really focused on characterisation on scale to assist with decommissioning, to understand the potential for bioaccumulation and the behaviour of different components. So, in improving our understanding of the risks to the environment will enable industry to provide optimised decommission solutions and allow the regulator to set clearer expectations on the environmental protection requirements. Our radiation protection guidance must continually adjust to ensure that an all-hazard approach is taken to ensure protection of people and the environment. Positive steps have been taken, but there is certainly a lot more work to be done, not just in Australia, but internationally. Finally, plastics are also a growing concern that needs to be considered. In this article, the comparison of 400 tonnes of plastic pipes left in situ to 400 tonnes of plastic bags in the ocean may not be an appropriate comparison for risk, or indeed consider all of the hazards. However, it highlights the need to have strong research that understands all the hazards, and you have a strong scientific understanding of the risks in order to justify all approaches to decommissioning. Otherwise, public perception of what the risk truly is what will drive the agenda. So finally, ICRP publication 142 was published in December 2019, and I've just pulled out a few of the key principles, and I think they align very closely with and support the work and approaches that have been made so far in Australia. That you need to consider multiple hazards and pollutants. The radiological risk may not be the dominant hazard, and consequently, there has been no or limited radiological protection awareness. If the protection of non-human species is warranted, it should be dealt with after an assessment of radiological exposure appropriate for the circumstances, again taking into account all hazards and impacts, and a graded approach commensurate to the level of risk as well as other considerations, economic and societal, has to be appropriate. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Our next talk is also recorded. It's going to be from Rachel Pope-Nichols, who is out of the University of Missouri in the United States, and she's going to be talking about a comparison of veterinary radiation safety programs across the U.S.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Nichols, and I'm a health physicist at the University of Missouri. Sorry I can't be there today, so if you have any questions, my email address and phone number are at the end of the slides, and feel free to email me with anything that you have. So I'm going to talk about the comparison of veterinary medicine radiation safety programs across the United States today. So this study really came about when I was looking at our veterinary medicine radiation safety program, and I was thinking, are we doing things correctly? Are we doing things that other people are doing, or are we kind of outliers? What are some of the common procedures and practices that other institutions are implementing? And so we developed this survey that we sent out to different institutions to compare our different United States veterinary medicine programs, establish those common practices and procedures. And the way we did that was 2 phases. So the first phase, we had a survey that focused on RAM use, and then we followed it up with a survey that focused on X-ray use and also any follow-up questions from the first survey. And then what we wanted to do was compare what people were actually doing at their institutions and how that compared to the available guidance documents. So one of the first questions I asked in both of my surveys was what makes veterinary medicine challenging? And so you can see on this word cloud on the right side that here's a lot of different phrases that I got from my survey. So the patient is a wild card. A lot of the staff don't necessarily have experience working with RAM. And then on the left side, you'll see there's a couple different things that people have said regarding X-ray uses. So you have to worry about injury to the worker from the animal or injury to the animal because of the stress of the situation, and then also the scatter radiation. So there's a lot of unique things when working with animals and radioactive materials and X-ray uses that make it difficult and challenging, especially compared to the human use. So here's some common guidance that I use whenever I look at our veterinary medicine program. And the first is ICRP Report 148, which has been pretty great. It has some specific examples and it covers a lot of different details. Then there's New Reg 1556, Volume 7, which has an appendix for veterinary medicine. And then last year, the IAEA came out with their guidance document on veterinary medicine use. And then I'm sure you guys are all aware, but there's the ICRP Task Group 110, which is focusing on the radiological protection in veterinary medicine practice. And all these guidance documents are helpful, but they don't always necessarily provide specific examples, or if they do, they tend to contradict each other. So the first phase of the study was focusing on RAM use, and so what I did was create a digital survey using Qualtrics, and I sent it out to everybody that I could find that had any sort of veterinary medicine program in the United States. And so my survey had 27 questions, and I got 26 responses, and I won't have time to touch on everything that we found today, but topics in general covered how do you set up your program, how do you handle the release criteria, so like how long are you requiring your patients to stay at your facility before you leave, what kind of dose rates are you requiring before they can leave the facility, and then other special things like how do you handle your waste. So I think that one of the most common questions that comes up in veterinary medicine radiation safety programs is how to actually calculate your release values. So how long are you requiring your animals to stay at your facility before they can leave, and what kind of dose rates do they have to have before they can leave? And this is difficult because I think there's no specific requirements in the regulations like there are for human use in the United States. And then you have all of your guidance documents which can directly contradict each other. And so a prime example of this is in ICRP 148, you have release dose rates that are at 1 meter versus New Reg 1556 talks about release dose rates at 6 inches or 1 foot. And so it makes it difficult for institutions to feel confident in the values that they've established and how they're doing it. And so I asked people, how are they calculating these values? And so a lot of people said that they've just done studies at their facility, or they've used journal articles where other people have published their results. Some people had pre-established criteria in their radioactive materials license. And then some people were just saying, hey, I'm just following 10 CFR 20 limits, which say members of the public can't have more than 1 millisievert a year. So here's an example of taking the guidance documents and then comparing it to my survey results. So based off of the results, one of the most common procedures used at all the institutions was I-131 in felines. And so in New Reg 1556, Volume 7, we have this example of a cat being treated with I-131, and they recommend a holding time of 4 days, and that the dose rate either be 1 millirankin per hour at 6 inches or 0.25 millirankin per hour at 1 foot. They recommend written instructions be provided, and that the licensee must demonstrate that the dose to the public from exposure of this patient to the public would be 0.02 millisieverts in any 1 hour or 1 millisievert per year. And so comparing this to the survey results, we see that the holding times are very, very much compared to the guidance document, anywhere between just not having any holding time requirements all the way up to 10 days, depending on the procedure and the specific circumstances. And then you can see that the dose rate release limits are anywhere between 0.5 millirankin per hour all the way up to 5 millirankin per hour. And the distance that these dose rates are measured at are all over the place. So we have 1 foot, 10 centimeters, 1 meter. And so it's hard for a program to take the guidance documents, take the regulations, and successfully implement these while feeling confident in what they're doing. So the next part of my study was focusing on X-ray uses. So I sent out the survey, I made a new survey, and I sent it out to the same group of people, and then expanded it to see if there were any other people that wanted to respond. And so this survey, I got 18 responses, and I had 30 questions. And so a couple different topics I covered were, again, how do you set up your program? How do you maintain your equipment? What kind of animal handling requirements or practices do you implement? Different types of training topics. And then I made sure to follow up on any additional questions from the RAM survey that people kind of had. So the first part of my X-ray survey was really focusing on how are people setting up their program. And so I was surprised to find that 71% of people said that they had low to minimal daily involvement in their veterinary medicine operations. And I definitely can understand that, because at the University of Missouri, we have the veterinary hospital, we have campus, and we have the human hospital. And we have about 4 people to support all of these. And so it does make it difficult to have a daily presence in your facilities when you have limited staffing and limited resources. I also asked people how often they anesthetize their animals, and 88% of people said yes. And interestingly enough, the same amount of people basically said that they still are holding their animals during these X-ray procedures, which across the board and all the guidance, it says, do not do this because you will get unnecessary exposure to yourself. And then I know my head is blocking the results here, but 94% of people said that they were wearing lead aprons, followed up with 83% of people wearing leaded gloves, and 61% of people were wearing lead thyroid shields whenever they were handling the patients and doing these X-ray procedures. So then I asked how people are implementing different safety practices across their institutions. And so there's this idea in the regulations that an animal patient is not technically considered a patient, so we don't necessarily have to consider their exposure or necessarily their safety whenever using ionizing radiation. And so I asked different institutions, are they actually monitoring their patient doses? Because in human hospitals, this is something that some places do. And almost 70% of people said no, they don't even monitor or maintain their animal patient doses. And then I asked, of the people that are actually monitoring and maintaining them, are they having some sort of formal patient dose policy implemented at their institution? And 53% of people did say yes, they do have some sort of formal patient dose policy. And I think this is similar to how we have the image wisely, image gently concepts, where we don't want to overexpose our patients, but there's nothing really available like that for animal use up until the ICRP Task Group 110 that focuses a lot on the patient safety during these procedures. So for future considerations for this study, I definitely want to take my results and make them publicly available so that other institutions can see what we're doing across the United States. I also think that there's plenty of opportunity to follow up and do additional surveys that focus on the topics that you see on my screen right now, as well as taking, at least at the University of Missouri, what I've learned and making our own program better. So I just want to say thank you to all the people that responded to my survey when they didn't have to. Without their responses, I wouldn't have anything to present to you today, so it's really appreciated. If you have any questions about what I talked about today or are curious what the rest of my survey results were, feel free to email me. My email and my work phone number are up on the screen, and I would love to talk more. And if you are interested in actually taking the survey, I'm always happy to send it to you and see what your facility is doing. Thank you.
Our last talk today before the Q&A is also recorded. John Pentreath is going to be giving a recorded presentation on protection of or radiation protection of animals.
Good afternoon, everyone. The issue of the protection of the animal as patient in veterinary medicine was raised a few years ago, and an ICRP task group then explored the subject in some detail. It has since been further addressed as part of another task group that has considered radiological protection in veterinary practice as a whole. Indeed, the ICRP's current strapline is now that of protecting people, animals, and the environment around the world from the harmful effects of radiation. And if it means what it says, then such an expansion has important implications for the overall ICRP framework, because in expanding it even further, it is important to do so in a manner that complements and reflects the elements that the current framework already contains. And it must also be seen to have been derived from the top down, whereas the many advances in relation to the protection of animals since the publication of ICRP 103 back in 2007 have essentially arisen from the bottom up. So what about the framework's overall scope? And what about the ethical principles underlying it? At the moment, it considers animals in the context of the natural environment, and more recently in the context of veterinary practice. But animals are also frequently subject to screening programs relating to their sale, their insurance, or their breeding potential. And large numbers of animals are still used in experiments under laboratory conditions. They're also exposed to radiation for what one may be described as purely commercial reasons. Take this advert, for example. It says, "Why CT scan your sheep?" Good question. Are they ill? No, it's to measure their meat quality, to determine when best to kill them. Do such exposures do more good than harm? Where would this practice fit within an overall ethical framework? At the moment, we have publications on the ethical basis for protection in relation to exposures of humans and of the environment, and we've reviewed those in relation to veterinary practice. But in a revised system, we need a clear, comprehensive, and overarching ethical basis that explains what is included or excluded from it. So, is an expansion of the existing framework necessary? Well, yes. At the moment, we consider the effects of radiation on animals in an environmental context, essentially at the population level. But in veterinary practice, a different perspective is required, because the principal concern here is that of the risk to an individual animal, primarily by way of the diagnosis for and treatment of cancer. Unfortunately, databases are few and far between. But in the UK, one study found that cancer was one of the major causes of death for dogs, accounting for more than 25% overall and increasing with age. With respect to other animals, cancer is common in domestic cats, though less commonly reported on than in dogs, and the prevalence of different types of cancer in dogs and cats are quite different from each other and different from humans. And horses are different again. Thus, just to remind you, all of the techniques applied to humans are now applied to animals, particularly in North America. And this is likely to increase greatly worldwide over the next decade. Use is made of what in many cases, I guess, second-hand CT scanners. There are PET scans, and animals are treated with Linacs and even brachytherapy. There is little in the way of guidance in relation to dose in these treatments. The results are not always pretty. The doses delivered to dogs can be up to 70 gray, and there is already concern about the knowledge base upon which such treatment is itself based. There is therefore a need for guidance from us, the community that understands the effects and risk of radiation, and for such guidance to be based on a clear scientific framework. At the moment, we have a framework that uses reference phantom models and databases that are used to relate exposure to dose and dose to risk to humans. And a similar and complementary reference approach has also been developed to help manage radiation exposures in the context of protection of the natural environment, for which a number of reference animals and plants, RAPs, have been described. All of these scientific points of reference have then been used to provide practical guidance by way of diagnostic reference levels for human patients and by way of derived consideration reference levels to help optimize the appropriate response to different environmental exposures for wild animals. This systematic approach now clearly needs to be extended to help formulate advice with regard to veterinary practice. There are several computational anatomical models already available, including at least 5 for dogs, and there are many data relating to radiation effects at different doses. But with regard to enumerating risks to individual animals, there is no equivalent to the CVET. Recommendations have, of course, already been made by the ICRP to the effect that an RBE-weighted absorbed dose should be used for radiological protection purposes for biota in an environmental context. But if this system is to be extended to the protection of animals at an individual level in veterinary practice, then risk-based quantities are also needed. And indeed, the entire issue of quantities and units in a non-human context needs sorting out. An obvious place to start would be the derivation of diagnostic reference levels for animals, or at least for dogs, as an optimization tool. After all, there is a vast and seemingly untapped database to enable this to be done. Literally thousands of dogs, primarily beagles, have been sacrificed to obtain data on radiation effects for the benefit of the protection of humans. From 1952 to 1983, at least 7,000 beagles were used in just 6 laboratories in the USA alone. Dogs were irradiated by intravenous injection, inhalation, ingestion, external irradiation, implants, and so on. Large numbers were exposed to cobalt-60 and X-rays at dose rates from a few milligray per day to several gray under different exposure regimes. One large-scale study involved more than 1,500 dogs exposed in utero, exposure terminating at various ages up to a year post-conception. The occurrence of various cancers were then recorded later in life. None of these data have been interpreted with regard to their use in providing advice on the consequences of exposure to dogs in the context of veterinary practice, and it would seem that, in view of their sacrifice, there is now a moral duty to do so. Indeed, many of the data have probably never been fully released, or else currently lie in data repositories somewhere, covered in dust and forgotten. Many other countries had similar experimental programs, so the number of dogs sacrificed must run into the tens of thousands worldwide. The derivation of such a canine database could also be used to advise on limits for the use of radiation in other contexts. And of course, guidance is also needed on the therapeutic use of radiation. In conclusion, therefore, I think it is clearly opportune to revise the current ICRP radiological protection framework from the top down, both to reflect the changes that have already occurred since 2007 and to prepare for the future. In order to do so, one obviously needs to reconsider its scope with regard to what practices are included in it and which, if any, are not included, and why, and to expand it in such a way that it complements the basic scientific elements of the existing system. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I would like to say a special thank you to all of our speakers, recorded or otherwise. Even in the tight 10 minutes, everyone was within about 30 seconds of their time, which I think is pretty good. So we'll now open it up to questions from the floor.
So, Bernard again, ICRP President. I have a question for you, Gillian. I was really interested by your approach about norm and RLARP, and my question will be around the stakeholder involvement. You mentioned in your presentation the regulatory expectation and the role of the operator for the RLARP approach. Could you please give more information related to the dialogue between the operator and the regulator? Is there a communication to the population or not? Is there a relation between the operator and contractor? So could you explain just a little bit more about how do you proceed in Australia? Thank you.
Does this work? Does it? Okay.
Yep.
It works. So for the oil and petroleum industry, PANZA doesn't have a role in that stakeholder engagement process, but I think that's one of the things for a regulatory body like NOPSEMA, that it is important to present all of the different options and what the consequences are of each of those options. I would have to actually go back to NOPSEMA to see what their process is for their stakeholder engagement. I think at the moment, as you can see, there is a very significant decommissioning program required. How far down the pathway of actually implementing the decommissioning activities is probably not so clear because of these issues of what's the best approach. And there's so many variables that it's and so much work that needs to be done. And I think one of the things that has come out of the NDRI is really getting the operators on board and to provide that level of transparency with data because that's the information that's required out in the public domain to even have that conversation with people. So I think there is still a lot to be done in that space.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question for Gillian, very interesting. Just if you can clarify how you consider the criteria to classify radioactive waste coming from the oil and gas, if you consider the 1 becquerel per gram as a clearance, generic clearance, or also if you consider some criteria, so conditional clearance just to classify as hazardous waste and not such a radioactive waste to avoid so many disposal. Thank you.
Yeah. I think this is one of the issues that will come up as work progresses. At the moment, the 1 becquerel per gram, which is very focused on, I guess, human exposure pathways and disposal pathways, is one of the clearance levels. I know in speaking with Amy and Tom that 1 becquerel per gram in certain scenarios for leaving in situ can lead to higher internal doses for biota, but of course you have to do that assessment of what are the species present, is it actually going to matter? But then they've got other scales that are in the magnitude of 180 becquerels per gram, so leaving in situ or bring them to the surface. Other features that they've identified is methylation of polonium, for example, and it behaves in a very similar manner to mercury. So it changes the bioaccumulation properties because of that waste product. So I think being able to consider the different pathways and who is being exposed is very important going forward.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, hello. My name is Nabil Moussa from the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. My question is for Mr. Fernandez, and this is regarding the AI presentation, so thank you so much for that. My question is there a future path forward that is envisioned for machine learning and AI that can benefit, for example, collective dose in major sites, and the way that we can, harness the machine learning capabilities and things like that to help us find better patterns and understand those. So I wanted to just kind of connect the perspectives that you presented with certain applications that can be applied. Thank you.
Well, I think, okay, yeah, this is working. So yes, once again, I'm gonna go back to the clear question that we need to develop, right? I've seen research though on, and actually it comes from somebody here in Canada. They've used drones to do surveying, which is a very cool application. Of course, the whole purpose there is to, in a sense, make us a little bit lazier, because now we don't go and check things out, and also we do have to be a little bit careful on just trusting that it is doing it the way it's it was designed, simply because it can fail, and so that's something that I always ask people to be careful about, because AI is not perfect. It can design to, it is perceived to be perfect because it's repetitive, but it can fail. But again, to answer your question, yes, there could be a relationship between collective dose and machine learning. The challenge here is to get the right people to the table.
I also have a question. related to AI. So I find myself both excited about AI and also very concerned at the same time. So I wondered if you could comment as to what you think maybe the greatest benefit would be, and then also, I don't know if risk is the right word, but concern or things we have to be like careful about in terms of AI.
So I think there's one thing that's very, very common between, nuclear science, health physics, or radiation protection and AI, and it's, and we've mentioned it before, it's communication. I'll tell you why, because if you look into the development of AI, just as an AI, they look for performance, they got performance, let's say, you're classifying numbers or bills or whatnot. The idea there and the objective was performance, not necessarily, do people know how the ATM actually reads your bill? They never ask that question. And so this is something that I find, and I'll give you an example of one of my studies in the past. There's a lot of papers out there on how to, classify radionuclides, and people have done this, since the 90s. And one of the questions that I asked myself, and this is one of my latest papers, is it doing the right way? I find out that it wasn't, because the way it was doing it is because all the patterns are different. And then when you ask the question, can you explain to me why cesium is cesium, for example? Well, it won't do it. And so there's new techniques. There's a whole new area on this. It's called explainable AI, and might have 5 years into the table. Again, these are questions that have emerged because other people have been trying to apply them into their fields. The explainable AI came to the light because, Tesla had an accident, so who's at fault? How could we explain this? So that's part of the reason why I think we, especially as a highly regulated industry, can have a really big role into AI.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you. David Richardson from University of California. Maybe it's just a comment for Dr. Garnier-Laplace. I really liked the presentation of approaches for thinking through meta-analytic techniques to synthesize different types of experimental data. I had one question about the interpretation. You had a sort of an S-shaped curve, and along the x-axis there was dose. And the interpretation of it, and this was sort of the endpoint of the whole synthesis, so I think it's important, was something like the probability at a dose, magnitude x, of at least a 10% increase in the endpoint, regardless of the animal model or the endpoint examined. And I was just thinking about reframing that, because I think it's the proportion of experiments which have been reviewed which yield a predicted excess of 10% or more at that magnitude of dose. And I think it's an important distinction there between sort of the truth, which is what you're interested in, and interpretation of that, where that function is on the curve at dose X. This is the yield regardless of endpoint. And just saying that we reviewed 100 studies and some proportion of them yield an estimate of this effect above that and some proportion yield it below. Does that make sense? I think that there's a distinction there between what we're actually interested in and what that meta-analysis is going to yield, which is really just a proportion of the studies above some threshold and below.
Okay, so to make certainly clear my brief explanation during the talk about the different step of the development towards the obtention of the so-called endpoint sensitivity distribution for species within a same class, so which aims to broaden the representativeness of the so-called reference animals and plants at the higher level of the class, which is much higher than the family level, as it was proposed in ICRP 108. We need to to implement a kind of meta-analysis on the basis of comparable critical radiotoxicity value. So for the example I have presented about the dose rate or dose response relationship, is just an example of a typical curve that can be obtained to represent the ecotoxicity relationship in between the dose rates and the effects. And in a similar way that it is done for chemical ecotoxicity, we are making use of these 10% effects of the curve, because this is for deterministic endpoints like morbidity, mortality, and reproduction, which are those that are most relevant with regard to population demography, which is the aim of the protection for biodiversity. This estimated ED 10% is similar to the one that has been adopted for chemicals and for chemical regulation. So while doing so, we are very similar to what chemical ecotoxicity and chemical risk assessment implements. So that gives us advantage when we want to have an holistic approach of ecological risk assessment, which has to be, I would say, more or less stressor agnostic, because you need to do so certainly for radiological, for ionizing radiation if necessary, but also for other types of stressors. So this is one strength, and we wanted to follow up this way. And the sigmoid curves I have presented is only one example of the different models we have used, because we have used the best models in terms of statistical criteria to represent the dose or dose rate effects relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for sure, that could be an interesting thing to follow up on during the coffee break, too.
Sure.
Other questions? Did you have a question, Martha?
Oh, maybe I can ask a question, yes. Actually, Jacqueline, I was wondering, the AOP you mentioned, the approach, is that something that ICRP is already looking at, or is it something that you may want to, like work together with the ICRP on?
I don't know whether some task groups, new task group of ICRP will have a look to this concept. Actually, as I said, this is, as I'm part from NEA, it was easy to get connected with the OECD chemical safety program, which has been the leader in developing this AOP framework for the benefit of the chemical regulation, and also to make the best use of knowledge about mechanisms, biological effects from molecular interaction into the development of the so-called adverse outcomes or the development of a disease, to say that more adapted to health, to human health. So that was the opportunity to use this concept, which is, I believe, is really very powerful because we have a lot of very voluminous knowledge about radiobiology in different endpoints, aspects, and so on. So if we are able to structure better, in a better way, the different information we have from the existing literature, and give evidence of the causality in between the exposure and the potential adverse outcome pathway, we will certainly help to document the low dose and low dose rate area. This is our aim, and this is tackled by a topical group who is belonging to the high-level group on low dose research, which is one initiative of the Committee on Radiological Protection and Public Health of the NEA, and we are starting to see some good results, because we are on the point to publish together with the OECD one of the first radiation-induced AOP regarding lung cancer and deposit of alpha emitters in the OECD dedicated library dedicated to the IOP series. So I think this is just the beginning of the story. We need to be patient because there are lots of blocks or building blocks to do a full house about this, and we have to wait a bit more to convince more about the added value of this concept. But the working group is really working hard, and you will have, as I said, a presentation more detailed in that sense by Daniel Beaton during this week about what is ongoing within this area. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll close this out with a question. In one word, what do you think is the most important thing we should consider in the next set of recommendations? I will start because I created a very difficult game. I'm going to say clarity for my word. Marie-Claude, you have to go too.
Well, I'd say transparency in the methods.
Oh no, this is what I wanted to say.
You just made it difficult.
Okay, Mario.
Oh wow, I'll go with research. Definitely.
Slowly we're losing them out. I'll say all hazards.
Hyphenated word. It still
Hyphenated
counts.
word,
Yep.
it's still one.
So, I'm the last, so this is the contrary. I started with the talks, and I will have the last word, but it's difficult to find another one. I would say communication so that the transparency of the method is really well captured by anyone, and this is really more easy to say than to do.
Great. Awesome. Thanks so much, and if you'll join me in thanking our panelists and speakers today.
Thank you.